Welcome to Class 3 of Old Testament 102. We'll continue this week in our overview of the books of poetry. This week we'll focus our attention on Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs. Let's give our attention first to the book of Ecclesiastes. There's something that is of great importance that we need to understand and keep in mind as we think of biblical faith. And that is simply this: biblical faith does not try to stifle tough questions. Now, let's think about that for just a moment. Biblical faith does not try to stifle tough questions. Life is filled with tough questions. Life is filled with questions pertaining to the goodness of God in light of the fact that the world is filled with evil and trouble and trial and difficulty and pain and suffering and anguish. If we base our biblical faith on the idea that faith in God and a relationship with God will guard us against difficulties in life, then we have totally missed the message of true biblical faith. Biblical faith struggles with those tough questions of life. We don't shy away from them, and we don't allow those tough questions and issues of life to cause us to lose faith, or at least we shouldn't. Of course, we've probably all known some people who have allowed tough situations in life to call into question their belief in God. But the Bible teaches us that faith doesn't try to steer clear or shy away from tough questions. And Ecclesiastes certainly teaches us and underscores and reinforces that truth, because Ecclesiastes deals with some of the really tough questions of life. Christianity actually is a thinking person's religion. We don't just adhere to a list of rules and regulations. Christianity is not just simply fact-based religion. It's rather a religion for people who seriously think about life and the perplexities of life. Actually, this book can serve as a stepping stone to those who actually find biblical faith to be intellectually unacceptable. I've run across quite a few of those types of people in my Christian pilgrimage. There are those who just simply look at the Bible and say, well, first of all, it doesn't line up with scientific fact, and so it's intellectually unacceptable. I can't believe those myths and legends that are recorded in the Bible. I want to have my belief system based on facts, empirical evidence. And yet Ecclesiastes tries to serve as a stepping stone for those people who might find biblical faith unacceptable to their intellectual mindset. And this is such an important book of the Bible in light of that. The term Ecclesiastes comes from the title of the book in the Septuagint. And it's a word that actually refers to one who addresses an assembly of citizens. It's closely related to another Hebrew word, and the title, Qoheleth, a root which means to assemble or gather. And the name appears 7 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. Some modern English translations of the Bible generally will have this word translated as preacher. But we need to understand that Qoheleth is not a preacher in the modern sense of the word. The author of Ecclesiastes actually took his text not from the law and the prophets, but rather from his own personal observations about life and the perplexities and the difficulties that he faced in life. Now, who exactly wrote the book of Ecclesiastes? There's quite a bit of discussion and debate and disagreement on the subject of the authorship of Ecclesiastes. The writer, as we've already said, writes under the pseudonym Qoheleth. And there's actually never been any unanimity among scholars as to the identity of Qoheleth. From the very earliest of times, this book was attributed to the authorship of Solomon. Now that's even in light of the fact that his name never appears anywhere in the book, but it was generally accepted from early times that Solomon did indeed write the book of Ecclesiastes. When we think of this, there are several actual factors that point toward Solomon as being the author of this particular book. First, the root of the name Qoheleth is used in 1 Kings 8, and that's a passage in which Solomon gathers the people for the dedication of the temple. And so there's a parallel between the book of Ecclesiastes and the book of 1 Kings. Second, Qoheleth identifies himself in the book of Ecclesiastes as a king and a son of David, chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. So, a king and a son of David. That would certainly narrow down the possibilities of the authorship if we take that reference at face value and believe that the author was indeed a king himself and also a king in the lineage of King David. Third, Qoheleth's claim of great wisdom and of great works certainly would be conducive to an identification of him, the author, with Solomon. Solomon was a man of great wisdom, and he was also a man of great works. So, those two indicators inside the book itself would give credence to the fact that Solomon possibly was the author of the book. But the problem is there's no consensus on the authorship of the book of Ecclesiastes. As a matter of fact, even conservative scholars have joined liberal scholars in regarding the book as post-exilic. And if that's true, then therefore it cannot be Solomonic. And in some conservative works, Solomon's not even considered seriously as a possibility, not even discussed as a serious option for the authorship of the book of Ecclesiastes. Those who oppose Solomonic authorship have raised 5 major objections to the traditional view that Solomon actually wrote this work. Number 1, the author of Ecclesiastes seems to speak at some points from the standpoint of a third-party observer, and on occasion even as the critic of kings rather than as a king himself. That seems to be a rather heavyweight objection to Solomonic authorship. But there's more. The second objection is that Ecclesiastes supposedly shows the influence of Greek, Stoic, and Epicurean philosophy. Now, if that's the case, this book could not have possibly been written by Solomon because Greek influence, philosophical influence of the Greek philosophers did not come about until centuries after Solomon's lifetime. The third objection is that Ecclesiastes supposedly contains various anachronisms which would point to a post-Solomonic authorship. Number 4, the major argument against the Solomonic authorship is the language and the style of the book itself. Those who study linguistics seriously have said that the Hebrew used in this book is late, not early, which would put it in the post-exilic period. And finally, the times that are reflected in Ecclesiastes are generally characterized by misery and oppression. That doesn't fit the description of the Solomonic age as one of prosperity that we see in 1 Kings chapter 4 and other passages as well. So these five major arguments against Solomonic authorship certainly bear consideration and would certainly give us cause to call into question the authorship of this book by Solomon, the son of David and the king of Israel. Let's turn our attention now to the background of Ecclesiastes. The Jewish tradition is that Solomon wrote the Song of Songs in his youth, Proverbs in his maturity, and Ecclesiastes toward the end of his reign of 40 years. So, according to Jewish tradition, Solomon did indeed write the book of Ecclesiastes, and he's writing after many years as king of Israel, and he's pondering all of these perplexities of life, striving to reach an understanding as to what life's purpose really is. So in spite of the great prosperity which characterized Solomon's reign, the people were gradually drifting away from the Lord. There was a movement toward spiritual apostasy as actually they followed the example that was set by Solomon himself in taking all of those hundreds of wives and concubines and synchronizing the faith and the religious worship of Israel with the religions of all of these foreign nations from which he took his foreign wives. So it was a time of great material prosperity, but a time of spiritual moving away from God. The author, and we'll take into consideration that it was written by Solomon himself, but the author could see evil days ahead of the people of Israel because of their apostasy. And the author actually described it to some degree himself and was involved in this time of spiritual movement away from God. And when we give our attention to the structure of Ecclesiastes, the book actually divides itself up nicely and easily into different categories. When we look at the book itself, there's a general structure that's pretty clear, even to the casual reader. The book begins with a short prologue, and this prologue introduces some of the themes that the preacher is going to give consideration to in the confines of the book. The bulk of the book, chapter 1, verse 12, all the way through chapter 12, verse 8, is a rather long monologue consisting primarily of autobiographical reflections on the meaning of life, or, as the author says, the meaninglessness of life. And then finally, the book concludes with a brief epilogue in chapter 12, verses 8 through 14. So it's a very simple structure of the book itself. Completely throughout the work, the author seems to be showing two opposite views of life. First of all, he views things around him as the natural man would do, without any light of divine revelation. This would be the casual observations of life from someone from a non-religious, non-spiritual perspective. Just a casual observer of life's experiences and eventualities. But then on the other hand, at other times the author writes as one to whom God has personally revealed himself. So we see this antagonistic structure of the book where in portions and parts the author is struggling from a human perspective with life and the perplexities of life. And yet on the other hand, there are moments when the author is actually talking about how God has orchestrated events and how we as human beings should find the higher purpose in life as being striving after God, even from our youth. There's several distinct characteristics of the book of Ecclesiastes that should be considered in this overview. Ecclesiastes, as we've already noted, belongs to the classification or the domain of biblical poetry. Now, in our English translations, the fact of it being biblical poetry is concealed by the prose format in which we find in our modern English translations and versions of the Bible. Ecclesiastes contains quite a number of different literary forms. We see general reflections, for example, in chapter 1, verses 2 through 11. Just general reflections on certain aspects of life and how we're to understand and find meaning and purpose in these general reflections of life. It also contains personal or first-person reflections. And this just simply means that the author, whoever the author is, Solomon or whomever, is writing from his personal perspective and giving his own personal reflections on those experiences of life. In chapter 4, verse 9 through chapter 5 through 8, we see that the author is exhorting people to embrace certain philosophical aspects of life. So the book has exhortations or admonitions to the reader from the perspective of the author as he makes personal reflections on life and makes application to those personal reflections. Then he makes exhortations to his readers in applying the truths of his reflections to their own personal experiences. Then there are moments when the author is sharing individual wisdom sayings or proverbs. We see these in chapter 9, verse 17 through chapter 10, verse 20, where we're giving these individual statements, these proverbs and wisdom statements that would add meaning to life. The ultimate question we want to look at and think about for a few moments is, what is the purpose of the author? What purpose does the author have in mind as he pens the book of Ecclesiastes? Well, there's a negative purpose, and that is the author has the desire to convince his readers of the uselessness of any worldview which doesn't rise above the level of self. Now let that sink in for a moment. He wants to convince his readers of the uselessness of a worldview which doesn't rise above self. Now, if we think about that from our modern day perspective, from our contemporary setting, then we have to understand and realize that there are multitudes of people who view life as meaningless and useless because they can't view life from any perspective other than their own personal experience. For the individual who takes God out of the formula of a worldview, then life does indeed seem to be useless, meaningless, and having no purpose whatsoever. We live, we die, and that's the end. So the author wants to convince his readers that having that kind of mentality, that kind of mindset, is useless. And he demonstrates how totally vain and empty those living with that mindset have as they view life. He demonstrates the vanity of living for nothing other than worldly goals and self-centered mentality. But then there is a positive purpose that the author has as well. Now, this book doesn't just state life's difficulties, but rather it offers some positive suggestions for coping with those difficulties. Life is filled with difficulties. The Bible would lead us to understand and believe that those who walk closely in obedience to the teachings and the commands of the Word of God are going to experience difficulties in life. But those difficulties should not be allowed to call into question the existence of God or the goodness of God. And so the author of Ecclesiastes is offering positive suggestions for how to cope with those awful experiences and difficulties that come our way in life. So the negative purpose is to show us the uselessness of a worldview that does not have God at its center, and also to teach us that there are positive ways of coping with difficult life situations and experiences. The author lists 10 vanities of life in the book of Ecclesiastes. I'm going to give those to you on these next two slides just by way of reference without really going into detail or discussion on any of them. The author talks about the vanity of human wisdom that is void of an understanding of world workings without God. The vanity of human labor, that we work and work and work and then we die and it belongs to someone else. The vanity of human purpose. The vanity of human rivalry. Why do we pit ourselves against one another and feel that we're in competition with one another? The vanity of avarice, of just living life for the moment and getting all the gusto out of life. He talks about the vanity of human fame. What purpose does it serve to gain the attention and the attraction of the world? The vanity of human dissatisfaction, of human coveting, of human frivolity, and even of human awards. What's the purpose of human awards? They're just going to rust and corrode and turn to dust eventually. So he gives all of these vanities of life that really, without God at the center, prove to be meaningless and of no value. Let's give our attention for just a moment now to the value of the book of Ecclesiastes. When we think about it, the book of Ecclesiastes is probably the most contemporary book in the entire Bible. Now, we can think of other books that are contemporary. For instance, the book of James is a very practical handbook on Christian living. But Ecclesiastes is actually even more contemporary than that, because the negative sections of the book are meant to give us an expose of the things which dominate our modern culture. Things like sex, work, education, fame, drink. All these things are a part and parcel of everyday life. But the book of Ecclesiastes is an expose against them, revealing that any of these, all of these combined, are not going to add true meaning and purpose to life without having God at the very center of our existence. In the book, the author creates a gallery of what we might refer to as satirical portraits of the hedonist, those that are just going for pleasure in life, the workaholic, those who are trying to find purpose and meaning in life by the things that they do, the plutocrat, the fool, the unfaithful woman, Ecclesiastes as a whole stands as what we might refer to as the ultimate critique of secular humanism, putting self first and living from the perspective that life is all about me and revolves around me. So, the book of Ecclesiastes is a powerful book, a wonderful book, a contemporary book, even though it was written thousands of years ago now. Still yet, it is a very contemporary book because it deals with those things with which we all struggle. Let's give our attention now for just a few moments to the book of the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon. Someone has said if Psalms is worship literature and Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes are wisdom literature, what is the Song of Songs? Worship literature and Psalms, wisdom literature, Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. What category could we give for the Song of Songs? Well, there are those who think it's in a category all its own. Perhaps we could designate it as wedding literature. In recent years, scholars have begun to recognize this book as a further example of wisdom literature rather than wedding literature, because they see in it spiritual implications and applications that go beyond a simple understanding of this book being wedding literature. They believe, those who hold to that view, that love is a basic human experience, and human experience is what wisdom literature is really all about. So thereby and therefore they would classify this as wisdom literature because it talks about a basic human experience and gives wise advice on the proper use of love. The book of the Song of Songs has 8 chapters, and each of these chapters celebrate one of God's greatest gifts to man, human sexuality. Human sexuality is not something to be thought of as perverse. It's not something that's to be thought of as a topic that we talk about in dark rooms and with hushed voices. But rather it is a beautiful aspect of the human makeup created by God Himself. God is the one who created human sexuality, and the Song of Songs celebrates this human aspect, this human attribute of sexuality. It's the 5th and last of the poetic books, and it's known in English by 2 different names. Some refer to it as the Song of Solomon, while others refer to it as the Song of Songs. The designation of the book as the Song of Songs is probably the most fitting for 2 very important reasons. Number 1, the book deals with the theme of themes, which is love. Now, the reason we would say that it's the theme of themes is simply because the Bible tells us God is love. Now, yes, it tells us that God loves, but God loves because God is love. God can do nothing other than love because love is an attribute of God. It's one of those attributes that we would refer to as communicable attributes of God. And what we mean by that is it's an attribute of God that is communicated to His human creation. There are attributes of God that are not communicable. They are not given to us. For instance, God is omniscient. He knows everything. We are not omniscient. That is a non-communicable attribute of God. But love is a communicable attribute of God, and this book deals with that theme, love. Second, its literary excellence is such as to make it worthy of the gifted king to whom it's attributed. It's attributed to the song as being the Song of Solomon, and yet the Song of Songs is more fitting because of these two reasons. When we give our attention to the book itself, the opening verse of the book appears to have been written by Solomon by using the formula which is to Solomon. But that phrase doesn't actually convey the absolute certainty of Solomonic authorship. Some scholars have suggested that this formula of dedication for or about rather than an attribution of authorship. So it could be a song for or a song about Solomon rather than a song of Solomon. The lack of any historical reference in the book makes it the dating of the book rather difficult, and this again lends to the difficulty of absolute certainty about Solomon actually being the author of the book. If we accept the fact, the belief that Solomon is the author of the book, then it was probably written sometime early in his reign as king, in the days of his sexual vitality, and it would probably be dated somewhere around 965 BC. If Solomon did not write the book, then those who believe it was written by someone other than Solomon would point to a much later period of time, to the Persian, perhaps even the Greek period for the dating of this book, which would put it well after the lifetime of Solomon. Now, there's no reason, not any sufficient reason, to deny that the book was actually written by Solomon himself. And so we would actually embrace the idea, the traditional view and the traditional belief that Solomon actually wrote the book. So let's give our attention now to the background of the Song of Songs. Solomon came to the throne in about 970 BC. He was famous for a lot of things, and he had many wives and concubines. We learn this from 1 Kings 11:3. And most of these marriages were for political reasons. Solomon was a very wise king, and he understood how important alliances with other nations would be in strengthening his own kingdom. And so he would make alliances with other nations by marrying into the royalty of those families, and thereby make political alliances, strengthening the kingdom of Israel. On one of his many trips to the northern part of his land, the king met and fell in love with a beautiful maiden. This maiden was then given in marriage to Solomon by her brothers. The Shulamite maiden, however, loved someone else. She loved a shepherd back in her own country. The book, therefore, is a story of Solomon's struggle to actually woo this maiden to true love, and her steadfast commitment and determination to remain faithful to her beloved. So the book itself is a story of human love, human sexuality, and the desire of Solomon to have the total love and commitment of the Shulamite, and the Shulamite's struggle to embrace the love of Solomon while finding somehow to deal with her feelings toward this shepherd back in her own land. So in light of that, how do we find the purpose of the Song of Songs? Well, one theme that is absolutely crystal clear as we read this book is love. Pure, sensuous, youthful, passionate love. Now in our modern culture, especially in light of our Puritan background, would lead us to believe that human sexuality is not something we talk about in the open, and it's certainly not something that we talk about in Christian circles. And yet the Bible has quite a bit to say about human sexuality and the proper way of handling our human sexuality and the drives and desires that God has built into us in our human makeup. It was God himself who created us male and female. It was God himself who told Adam and Eve that they were to procreate, which certainly is the involvement of human sexuality in the carrying on, the procreating of the human race. And so it deals with love and sexual love at that. And the Song of Songs would present us with the idea that this aspect of the human makeup is one that is pure and undefiled in the eyes of God, and one that should lend itself to fulfillment in the relationship between a husband and a wife. The immediate purpose of the Song of Songs is simply to bear testimony and to actually applaud the steadfast loyalty of one maiden for her beloved. So it talks about the sanctity of the relationship between a husband and a wife. So the Song of Songs is a beautiful book that talks about God's ultimate purpose of his seal of approval on the genuine love between the sexes. It's a beautiful book. It's also a very graphic book. Now we can read it and we can think, well, this is not a very graphic sexual book, but we have to try to understand it from the Hebrew perspective. From the Hebrew mindset, this was indeed a very graphic book describing the intimacy between a man and a woman, a husband and a wife. So the book is vitally important for us in understanding our role as male and female, and specifically as husband and wife, and the commitment and the binding that goes along with being totally committed to one another in a bond of human relationship and marriage. That's the conclusion of our study of the poetical books of the Old Testament. In our next study, we're going to give an introduction to the books of prophecy, and then for the remainder of the quarter, we'll be dealing in detail with the books of prophecy themselves. And so be thinking ahead about the books of prophecy. Read in your textbook the chapter on the introduction to prophecy, and we will go from there. God bless you. Hope you have a wonderful week, and I will be back with you next week as we continue our study of Old Testament survey.